As the conflict in Ukraine continues, are we seeing a new international order emerge? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The conflict in Ukraine is being condemned around the world, but there is a clear division on how nations view the situation. The majority of the world has adopted a neutral stance, which has incensed countries like the United States. We will look at that in a bit more depth in a bit, but first let's take a look at the situation in Ukraine. Despite pullback claims from Russia, Kyiv says the bombardment is continuing in the city. Ciaran McQuillan has more from Lviv.
You may remember in the early stages of this invasion, video of people huddling under a bridge and then trying to cross a torrent of water on planks. It became one of the defining images of those early days of this invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces as people fled incoming Russian shells and incoming Russian troops. On Monday, Alexander Markushin, the mayor of Irpin, said that the city had been liberated from Russian troops. Today, he told people not to go back.
During the heavy fighting, at the time that the town was under fire 24/7, residents were burying the victims in the yards and parks. I think approximately 200 to 300 people were killed. Many are still under the rubble. Do not return to town yet. It is dangerous. I will tell you when to come back.
Yesterday in Istanbul, there was a hint of optimism when Russia said that it would pull back some of its ground forces from around Kyiv and another key city that's been surrounded, Chernihiv, in the northeast of the country. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine say that they had noticed a partial relocation of individual Russian units. However, Alexander Pavluk, who is the head of Kyiv's military regional administration, said that 30 Russian shells had landed around the capital. Now, it looks like Russian forces could be shelling these positions around Kyiv and Chernihiv to keep Ukrainian forces at bay and prevent them from coming across to join a new front that is opening up in the east of the country in the Donbass region. US President Joe Biden had a one-hour conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, this afternoon. The readouts from both men's conversations paint a slightly different picture. The White House stressed how the United States is working around the clock to provide some of the military assistance that Ukraine has wanted. The Ukrainian readout, on the other hand, stresses that Ukraine needs more military supplies. From Lviv, for CGTN, this is Ciaran McQuillan.
To discuss the impact of the conflict in Ukraine, let's bring in our panelists. From Sao Paulo, Brazil, Gilson Schwartz is a professor of economics at the University of Sao Paulo. From Beijing, Andy Mok is a senior researcher at the Center for China and Globalization. Chidanand Rajghatta is foreign editor for the Times of India newspaper. He is here in Washington, D.C. Also here in Washington, D.C. is John Sitilides. He is a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. John, let me start with you. Great to see you again. This war has now entered its second month, and there have been divisions that have emerged around the world on how this war is being viewed. The Western perspective on the war is that Russia and Russia alone is responsible for this war. And we are reminded every day in the Western media that this is an unprovoked attack on a sovereign state. But there are some who think very differently. Let's listen to one view. This is the view of the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa.
The war could have been avoided if NATO had heeded the warnings from amongst its own leaders and officials over the years that its eastward expansion would lead to greater, not less, instability in the region.
So that's one view there, John. And as this war goes into its second month, as I said, and if we look at how we came to this point, when we see the kind of death and devastation taking place in Ukraine right now, could this war have been avoided?
Well, there's no way of knowing today, Anand, but I think the point of your original question is a very important one. The global West seems to be rather united, the United States, the European Union, and key allies such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Australia in the Indo-Pacific region. But as you just noted with the soundbite, you have the leaders of India, of China, of South Africa, of Brazil, who've taken a different stance, and maybe part of the statements about how we got to war is a justification for the positions they're taking now that are based largely on their respective national interests. For instance, a country such as India, it's had a very long, decades-long armaments relationship with the former Soviet Union, now Russia. It wants to be able to defend itself against possible conflict with China or with Pakistan. South Africa and Brazil are major food exporters and depend on Russia and Ukraine for fertilizers and petrochemicals to be able to sustain their agricultural industries. And so every country will take its own national interest into play. This isn't playing out as a morality issue around the world. It's government leaders standing up for their national interests, and there will be divisions among world countries.
All right, let me go to Chidanand for his view. Chidanand, many countries have abstained in that vote at the United Nations to condemn Russia. The message from them was that, look, it's not that we support Russia, it's that we're not taking sides in this. That, as I said, has made Western nations very angry. When we look at this, are we seeing the emergence of a new independence among the global South, which is basically saying, look, we're not going to automatically support the West like we did in the past?
Yeah, I don't think there's any coordinated global South action here, like your first speaker said, and I agree with him entirely. Every country is dictated by their self-interest, and I don't think in many cases abstention at the UN means any kind of support for the Russian invasion. I can speak about India's position. I actually sense it. If you read the explanations that accompany the abstention vote, there is an implicit disapproval of what Russia has done. The point about Russia was pushed to the wall by U.S., NATO, and Russia cornered Russia, struck back doesn't make sense because there was a line in the sand. This was obviously an invasion. There's no doubt about that. The Russians went into Ukraine, deep into Ukraine. A correct response for the U.S. pushing its NATO to Russia's border would have been for Russia to push back with an anti-NATO or a Warsaw Pact kind of thing, if necessary, maybe in the Caribbean, maybe in South America, which is push back at what the U.S. holds dear, its Monroe Doctrine, that foreign powers will not interfere in its sphere of influence. But what happened here, and I think India's vote has to be seen, and the abstention has to be seen in that context, is the Russians crossed into a sovereign nation. It was an invasion. India itself has resisted this temptation vis-a-vis Pakistan, despite many provocations. There has not been an instance of India, invading Pakistan or Pakistan-held territory. So I think, one has to have some clarity about, the Russian overreach. But that said, you're right. I mean, not every country in the world, agrees with, the Russian explanation. And many of the abstentions are guided by self-interest, and particularly in terms of dependence on energy, depends on, fertilizer. In India's case, legacy defense supply from Russia. So I think we are seeing individual stance. I don't think there's any coordinated South, but certainly there is reservation, and plenty of reservation about what the U.S. and NATO countries have done in terms of expanding. I mean, NATO ended at Italy's borders in 1949, and since then it has now reached the Russian border from 19 countries to 30 countries today, and to a lot of people this was unnecessary. In fact, if you go back when the Soviet Union collapsed, and in the years and the decade after the Soviet collapse, Russian leaders, including Gorbachev and Putin himself, asked to be part of NATO. But making Russia a part of NATO would have simply defeated the purpose of NATO.
Right.
So they were both rejected. There's plenty of conversations about Russia actually wanting to be part of NATO, and it would have been a natural alliance in terms of facing up to China today, but that didn't happen. And so in one sense, the U.S. and NATO, picked their enemy and refused to back down. Russia struck back, but obviously it's been a strategic overreach and a strategic blunder.
Okay, let me get Andy Mock's view on this. Andy, we just heard that this was overreach by Russia, but was it really overreach? Because Russia has been warning for years that it saw any NATO encroachment into Ukraine as a direct threat to its national security.
No, certainly the evidence was there for all that cared to see it, Anand. And I think here we have to recognize there really are three wars going on. So, of course, there's the military conflict in Ukraine, but there also is a narrative or propaganda war going on globally. And part of it is for the fight for the support of countries around the world. But finally, there's an economic war. And here I would say that, of course, every country, whether in the global south or the industrialized West, of course, is going to pursue its own national interest. But I think we need to recognize from the global South's perspective that there is a coalition of like-minded countries, even though they might not explicitly call themselves as such, but they're joined by a common threat, and that threat is the economic war. And I think the global South will actually be the biggest victims. So we see the tragic scenes in Ukraine, but it makes great television. I think what is not seen, and is going to get worse, is the economic fallout, the higher energy, the skyrocketing energy prices, food prices that will hit people in the global South who are the most vulnerable. And I think this is the real tragedy of this conflict.
Do you also sense, Andy, that the global South, developing nations, have seen what the United States has done to Russia financially with these imposition of financial sanctions? And they, as you say, they may not be acting as a formal group, but they've seen what happens and they want to lessen their dependence, let's say, on the United States dollar, for instance.
No, that absolutely is true, Anand. And I think, again, if there is overreach, it's perhaps on the part of the United States. These economic sanctions, unprecedented set of sanctions, were meant to shock and awe Putin into submission. But in fact, I think the quote-unquote cure may be much worse than the problem they were intended to solve, because this really has raised serious doubts around the world about the reliability of the U.S. as a financial referee, because we now clearly see that these sacrosanct rules around property due process can be blatantly ignored, as we see with the seizure of Russian central bank assets. And there's an argument made. So I was at a dinner last night at a European ambassador's residence with a number of European representatives. And the case was made, this is such an extreme action by Russia that it's justified. But I think we're on a slippery slope here. And, you know, this is really causing concern, not just the immediate energy and food crisis that I think is only going to worsen unless, again, there's some dramatic change, but also this calling into doubt of the global financial architecture, not just by countries in the global South, but I think really countries all around the world.
Gilson Schwartz, Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, he visited Moscow in the weeks before the war started. He went ahead with that visit despite pressure from Washington to cancel it. And he has also said that Brazil is not taking sides in this conflict. Does that surprise you?
Well, it's not really a surprise, because Brazil imports 80% of its fertilizers. Can you imagine that? One of the biggest exporters in the agro-industrial sector, importing 80%. From those 80% of fertilizer imports, more than 20% come from Russia. We even import coal from Russia. It's unbelievable. So I think that it's not really a political perspective that Bolsonaro has adopted. I think it's really very pragmatic. It's in the tradition of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Brazil, because after all, the economy has been deindustrialized over the years with recessions and political crisis. And our main sector now for promoting growth, generating wealth, and mostly for the provision of foreign reserves is the export of commodities. Brazil has gone through all these years basically converting itself into a exporter of commodities. Most of them are agricultural products. So we are heavy importers of Russian fertilizers, and I think that Bolsonaro there was not the Bolsonaro, the politician, but was really the Bolsonaro responding to the pressures of the very strong agricultural sector in Brazil that, of course, depend. Another interesting detail, so to speak, the production in Brazil in terms of spending in agriculture for the imports of fertilizers rose last year by 81%. So we are basically going through a boom in commodities, and I think that Bolsonaro had no way out except for begging for Russian exports of fertilizers to be somehow protected in the midst of the conflict. It's really a pragmatic position, not a political position, and I think that in terms of ideology, Bolsonaro is still the same. And he will forever be against the state, against social issues, against culture, and against the environment. But we need fertilizers. That speaks, volumes in terms of what to do in terms of our foreign policy.
John, as we've been hearing from almost everybody, that countries will act in their own interest. But if we look at these sanctions that have been imposed against Russia, more than 6,000 of them, they're some of the harshest sanctions we've ever seen being imposed on a single country. The question is, are these sanctions going to work? Because what we've seen it do is actually deepen the division between the United States and Western Europe and the rest of the world.
You've raised some very important points here, Anand. First of all, let me just emphasize that, yes, there were about 6,000 or whatever the precise number is of sanctions on Russia, but they're not really against the Russian economy or the Russian government. Most of those are against Russian individuals. And so countries such as North Korea and Iran are actually far more sanctioned even today than is the Russian government or the Russian economy at large. But I think one of the most important lessons here is the misguided or foolish policy of allowing a country, in this case many EU countries, beginning with countries such as Germany and others, to become energy dependent on Russia, on an unreliable adversarial country. And the idea that you could become dependent for your food, for fertilizers, for petrochemicals, for oil and natural gas on a country as important, as powerful, and as angry, if not frustrated and belligerent regarding its invasion of Ukraine as Russia, has left Europe vulnerable to precisely this type of invasion. And so Putin, I think, saw weakness in the European Union, its willingness to close down nuclear power plants, natural gas reserves, coal reserves, in order to move to renewable energy that simply could not provide for an industrialized, advanced economy throughout the EU. And even with the sanctions that we've seen that are being imposed by the EU, they're not as comprehensive as the U.S. has attempted to impose on. So 4 of the 5 major banks in Russia are not cut off from SWIFT under the EU sanctions. And I think for the month of March, as of yesterday, the day before, we see that European tankers heading to Russia to load up for oil to bring back to for European markets is pretty much the same as it was in 2021 and 2020. So we haven't seen any major drop-off yet in terms of European Union oil purchases from Russia. So we also see the Russian banking system already starting to somewhat stabilize. And Putin's very, very clever hand here in insisting that oil and natural gas be purchased in rubles and potentially moving that to apply to food, fertilizers, and other commodities strengthens Putin's hands and allows him to fund his war, his invasion against Ukraine, to the tune of $500 million to $1 billion a day, as long as Europe and other countries remain dependent on Russian commodities.
That's right. We have seen the ruble appreciate in value over the past few days. Gilson Schwartz, there is another view of the Western sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, and that is and that view is that it's Western sanctions that hurt Russia. The West does not really need the support of developing nations to inflict the kind of economic pain it wants to on Russia. I mean, is that a valid argument?
I think that the most important thing for the global South now is the question that you raised at the beginning of our conversation here. It's whether a new global order is in the making or what kind of new framework for economic cooperation is about to come out of this situation. Let's remember from the perspective of Brazil that we have a long-term project that's connecting Brazil to Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And like this, there are many other examples of different configurations of international relations with respect to trade and investment. The other day we were commenting here about the importance of Chinese investments in Brazil. So I think that Brazil and South America in particular are a very special case, so to speak. I've already used this image that we are facing both the Pacific and the Atlantic. We are in the South, but we have a very diverse pattern of trade and lots of presence here from all different countries of the world. So it's different if we compare that to other regions in the South or non-aligned governments. It's really more complex, more diverse. And I think that we are going through now is like a deglobalization where regional projects, regional platforms are going to thrive. We already saw that with the vaccines, I'm sorry. All the efforts that have been put in place by the advanced and industrialized economies with respect to resuming their activity and producing vaccines, that was not distributed to the South. We have this still a problem, the share of people in the South that have had access to vaccines. Right. So I think that what we are witnessing right now is not only a conflict in Ukraine, but is really the making of a new non-global order.
Chidanand, on the question of a new global order emerging, there are many analysts, many politicians who believe that this war is a turning point in the post-Cold War international order. In fact, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, said as much during a visit to China. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We are living through a very serious stage in the history of international relations. I am convinced that at the end of this stage, the international situation will be much clearer, and that we, together with you and with our sympathizers, will move towards a multipolar, just, democratic world order.
So, is this a turning point, Chidanand? I mean, we heard the Foreign Minister say that we'll see a very different world. I mean, how would that world look? I mean, would it be two blocks?
Well, I think things are in a flux, and by the way, the Russian Foreign Minister is on his way to India later this week. I think things are in a flux, and we'll have some clarity at the end of this conflict, not immediately, but in the weeks and months to come. I think it's broadly accepted that American power is on the decline, but whether it'll go away or fold up altogether, we don't know. The Americans are certainly not going to give up easily. As we all know, the 20th century was broadly described as an American century. And many people anticipated that the 21st century would be an Asian century with China and possibly India together. But now we have a situation where China and India themselves have a lot of differences. And so it's a very complex situation. I don't think there are easy answers to this. It could take months and probably a few years.
Yeah.
But one thing is certain, the United States is certainly not going to walk away into the sunset. And this conflict in many ways actually is going to decide whether the United States will remain relevant and remain a potent force in the rest of the 21st century, or whether China and India, and to a lesser extent Russia. I mean, really speaking, if you look at Russia is not all that. I mean, economically, it is actually a fairly modest economic power.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of focus will be on China. So it's a very complex matrix. We don't know how China and Russia will take this forward. They have promised a friendship without limits, without boundaries. And there's India in the mix, which has a close relationship with Russia, but which actually both, in terms of democratic values and liberal values, is more aligned with the United States. The Indians have, a huge diaspora in the U.S., 4 million.
Right.
It doesn't have 4 million, forget 4 million, doesn't even have 400,000 people in Russia or China for that matter. So the sense I'm getting is there's going to be plenty of flux over the next few months, and it'll be a few years before. And one of the deciding factors will be if the rest of the world does not go along with the United States, whether the position of dollar as a reserve currency will weaken gradually.
Yeah.
And this is a test case of whether that can happen and how soon that can happen.
Andy Mock, there is another fear among developing countries, and some of the countries have expressed this fear, and that is that the reason they're not taking sides is because they do not want to get embroiled in any kind of new Cold War that might start between Russia and Western countries. And we do know from the previous Cold War that it was developing countries that bore the brunt of that war, because that Cold War actually turned into hot wars in many of these countries. Do you see the beginning of a Cold War right now? I mean, how will that impact the world?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, Anand. And I think any country around the world does not want to be caught in the middle of a conflict because, of course, economic interests can be hurt as well as political interests. But I want to address this question of, are we entering a new era, which is related to this question of a new Cold War? And I think we are, and it's happening actually in Europe, because this conflict in the Ukraine can actually shatter NATO unity. And here's why. A couple quick comments on this. So the CEO of BASF, I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest, German chemical companies, said that if they are cut off from Russian gas, there would be significant, they would have to shut down one of their largest chemical plants, and there would be widespread unemployment. And he also went on to say there is no alternative to Russian gas in the short term. Russia provides something like 5.5 trillion cubic feet, not meters, but cubic feet of gas to Europe. So I think this is one issue. The other question, too, is there's enormous sympathy and support for Ukrainian refugees in Europe today. And this is seen as a point where the West is winning. But let's roll the clock forward. And if these refugees are still living in people's homes, going to their schools 6 months from now, I think this is going to put enormous political pressure that, again, may shatter European unity. The last point is the increase in defense spending. Now, what happens if we have countries that historically have been military aggressors in Europe become militarily resurgent again? And what will that do? So I think this, again, is opening up new situations, completely new dynamics that are tectonic in nature. And I think this is the real area to pay attention to when we think about this new era.
Okay, and time has caught up with us. We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.